Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Today we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about exploring the world on a motorbike. Along the way, we'll talk about the importance of food as part of a great journey. Here to talk about all this is Kix Marshall, author and filmmaker. Hi, Kix. Welcome to the show.
Mr. Richard, live and in person. Good to see you.
It's great to have you on here. We've never done a motorbike episode. Everything's been human powered, so this is totally different. But I remember watching the Ewan McGregor Long Way Around, Long Way Down, and being fascinated and talking to my brother-in-law about like motorbikes and how to do this. And so I'm actually super interested in doing a motorbike to do these trips. I know I've talked to people who've done motorbiking in the Himalayas, but that was more like dirt biking. So I'm super interested to learn from you today. To start with, I'm interested about this big trip you did from Canada to Argentina in 2016. And I want to know, how did you get to the point of thinking, oh yeah, I'm just gonna, ride a motorbike down to Argentina?
Well, thanks for breaking the mold, Richard. I appreciate you diverting from your usual trend of people. I've listened to lots of the podcasts on here, and lots of people have said, oh, you've done this great trip or different trips around the world and all this kind of stuff. But I hear people who've walked to the same places I've ridden a motorbike to, and I'm like, what have you done? You walked across the planet? So there's always someone doing something a little bit crazier than what you've done. But for me personally, great point with the Ewan McGregor segue. I was actually on a flight when I was maybe 23 or 24, something like that, on the way back from New Zealand. It was a long flight, whatever, 14 hours or something. And that series was on one of the shows on the plane. And so I turned it on and watched the first one, and then I watched the second one and watched the whole series. And before that moment, I had no idea that the world was connected by road. It never occurred to me. I just thought, okay, whatever, America ends here and Central America ends there and Africa ends there. That's kind of the end of it. But I saw them actually drive arguably around the whole planet via road. And at that moment, I'm like, I got to do this. I've been missing out on so many things. I didn't know you could drive everywhere. So I kind of sparked a little seed in me where I'm like, I want to drive around the world. And so I thought about that for years, but I didn't know how to do it. Those guys had sponsors and like a support truck and all this sort of help and movie stars. And I figured that's the only way you could do it. So I tried to raise like what I thought would be enough money to do the trip. 250 grand was what I'd sort of pictured it would take to drive around the world. And needless to say, I never got the 250 grand, but I still did the trip. And in the end, I ended up doing it for about $12 a day Canadian, or about $9 US, because that in the end was my budget. It wasn't 250 grand. It was closer to $12 a day. So that's how we did it.
Wow. Before you went off on this journey, had you been riding motorbikes before? Did you have experience, or was it kind of just learn how to ride a bike, learn how to, do maintenance and then head off?
Well, the caveat would be that you should probably have experience before setting off on a motorcycle journey. I didn't have much experience. A friend of mine owned a few motorbikes, and by this point I was in my 30s, and he just took me out one day on this old Suzuki, this blue Suzuki sort of cruiser bike he had, and we went to the edge of town, and we took off, and he's like, it's one gear down and four up, go straight and see how fast you can go. And that was my training for the day. And so the interesting part about where I live, I don't think it's the same everywhere, but you don't necessarily have to have a motorcycle license to motorbike. If you're with someone, they can sort of be your teacher. And so as long as I was within a certain radius of him, I could bike around. So he took me, and we did one trip that summer from Canada down to Idaho. And then that winter, I was like, we got to go somewhere else. So we took our bikes and hauled them down to Arizona, and then biked through Mexico for, I think, a month or 2 months. And that was amazing. I never traveled with that before. I'd only sort of like slept it around on buses and like hitchhiking sort of thing. Bought a car in a few places, but once I had the bike, I couldn't believe how much freedom it is. And you kind of make a connection with people. Same as if you have a pedal bike or a backpack, you run to those people, and those are your people. They're bikers or they're backpackers or they're hikers. So you get to know them really fast. And I was hooked. Like, I couldn't believe it right away. So after that, I bought a bike, and I decided I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try and drive down to as far as you can drive south. And I didn't really know what that meant or how long it would take, but it was harder than I thought it was going to be. And it took a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, but man, it was worth it.
Now you alluded to a little bit before. You traveled a lot before you did this, and I'm interested. You're from a medium-sized town, actually near where I'm based. How did you catch the travel bug, living in kind of like not a big travel city?
Yeah, I don't know, you have to sort of, well, unknowingly search for influences. I grew up in a fairly small town. I think it was 5 or 6,000 people. And growing up, I didn't really feel like there was a lot of culture in our town, but you don't know. It's where you grow up. So you just think that's the way the world is. Whatever the bubble you live in is the world and how it is. And so we did like camping and fishing and horseback riding. And my dad actually lived for like 5 years in the Rocky Mountains, like in a tent, in like a trapper's tent, basically. He was a bit of an adventurous guy. And so it was fun. I had lots of good times, but I always sort of felt in school and stuff that there was just like more to the world. I'd meet people once in a while and they have accents, and I'm like, where, like, that I come from Germany or I'm from Yugoslavia or something. And I'm like, where is Germany? Where's Yugoslavia? And I didn't know these places were on the map. I'm sure they were taught in school, but maybe I missed that section. And so I just wanted to see more of the planet. And after high school, I had asked a couple of friends if they wanted to go traveling around the world or backpacking. And they're like, no, I can't. I'm going to start this new career or I'm going to go to college. And I always kind of felt that maybe this was the time in my life where I was going to have the most time and probably need the least amount of money. I feel like, well, if I can camp in a tent, I could probably sleep in a hostel, or I can probably do lots of things on a bit of a budget. So I went through probably 3 or 4 friends trying to figure out how I was going to get out of the small town and go see the world that I didn't know anything about. And finally, I landed on a friend of mine who wanted to go, and he was probably the best choice for the job. He's a very outgoing guy, really great to travel with. And that year sort of opened up my eyes to things I didn't even know were possible. First stop was Japan and then Malaysia. And those two places were just like, Japan was basically another planet. And then so was Malaysia on two opposite sides. Japan was super futuristic, and Malaysia was super, I don't even know, 200 years ago, sort of, is what it felt like. And after that, I just couldn't believe how different things were in such a short distance. Like in one day, you can be anywhere in the planet. And so I decided to just keep on exploring after that. And I've never really been able to shake it ever since then. I just never, like, once you see something, you realize there's so many places that you're yet to see and yet to explore. So I think that the upside to the small town was that it was small enough and safe enough that I felt really comfortable with the world, but it also sort of alluded to the idea that there was so much more to see. So thank you, small town.
So let's talk a little about this trip you did. And can you maybe just share an overview of the route, the big picture of how you got down to the tip of Argentina?
Yeah, for sure. I'll dial back a little bit. I know you'd asked me in the first question, but I sort of jumbled a few things together there. But to get there, I'd sort of been thinking about this trip for a really long time, but didn't really know I was going to pull it off. And at the time, I've been an entrepreneur most of my life, and I was working away. And by this point, I'd had a restaurant and a catering company. We had a cafeteria and a few little businesses on the go. And it seemed like everything was going great. I think it was before I was even 30. I had these all sort of off the ground. I was working with my dad, and my family was helping out. We had a bunch of employees, and it was great. I felt like I really achieved something. And then one magical day, it all fell apart and came unwound, and it basically lost everything. And at that point, I realized I kind of had nothing to lose. And if I was going to do something different, now would be the chance to do it. So that's when I bought the bike and headed south. And the route I ended up taking with was I was living in Red Deer, Alberta in Canada at the time, sort of medium-sized city. And I just sort of spent the winter in a little shed behind my house. I had this little 10 by 10 tin shed. I put my bike in there. I figured if I was going to take a bike, I should take a simple one. I should learn how it worked. So I took the bike apart right down to the motor, and I was not mechanically inclined. So I asked a friend of mine, I'd look on YouTube and I'd search on, like, how do you get this thing apart? Because if I end up somewhere and no one can help me, I'm going to have to figure it out for myself. So I took it all apart right down to the bone in the shed in the winter with the propane heater inside, trying to keep me warm. And I got it back together, and after that, I felt pretty good about things. Once I knew sort of the ins and outs of how it worked, it was good. And then I just headed south. I wanted to get out of town before winter came, and I left I think just before Halloween, October 30th. And in Canada, that could mean, as you're fully aware, that could mean either a cool fall day or it could mean 2.5 feet of snow. You never really know. And so I got pretty lucky. It hadn't snowed much yet. I just kept driving until I got to sort of the lower half of the US where I knew I was safe and out of the snow. And then straight down through Mexico. And once I hit Mexico, I sort of got this sense of freedom and ease, and I slowed right down. After that, I did like at least a month, I'd say, in every country, sometimes 3 or 4. I think I spent 3 months in Mexico, and just sort of like wound my way through the Baja and then cross over to the mainland and then down through Central America and crossed over the Darien Gap, which is a tricky part of the route that most people have problems with. It's a 90-kilometer or so gap between Panama and Colombia. There's no roads. It's essentially run by drug cartel or what have you. And so you have to find a way around it. You can go on a plane, or you can go on a boat, or you can take a sailing ship or something like that to get around to Colombia. So I had to navigate that passage and then down through South America. But by that stage, it'd probably been a year by the time I got from Mexico to Panama. I think it just a bit of a year at that point. And so I was feeling pretty comfortable. I wasn't in a rush and just sort of wound my way through and did probably 3 months in Colombia and a month in Ecuador and a month in the Amazon, like a month in Bolivia, a couple of months between Chile and Argentina. I know that route is sort of popularized now as one of the main routes of the planet, but you can't underestimate how incredible it is to drive through all of the countries in the Americas. It's truly amazing to see the culture sort of melt and the different foods sort of change from one to the other. It's like unbelievably is quite an amazing part of the planet. And I would recommend that drive as like a good way to explore the planet to anybody who's willing to do it, whether it's in a car, a motorbike, on foot, you name it.
Now, your trip took from 2016 to 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah, I left in 2016 and got back in 2019. You are correct. It was about 2.5 years on average.
So what I think is incredible, and you traveled 61,000 kilometers, but we've had people who have ridden that route quicker on a pedal bike than you did on your
Yeah.
motorbike, which obviously goes way faster. Can you maybe talk a little bit about your approach? Like, you were not, pinning it every day, but like, what did like a typical month look like for you?
It was so good. One thing I will say is I ended up in Colombia when I was waiting to pass my bike from Panama to Colombia, and it's about a week or 10 days, which is odd because it should really only be one, for the boat, for like the sea can to ship from Panama over to Colombia. And we're there, and I met up with a bunch of other people who was doing a similar route at the time. And this guy was sitting next to me. We're chatting, and I was talking about my bike trip and how amazing I thought it was. I was driving along, whatever. And then I asked them about their trip, and they were in pretty good shape. And I'm like, "Oh, you guys have to?" He's like, "Oh, we're just running the trip." I'm like, "Well, yeah, you're probably in a bit of a rush. Do you have to be back for something?" He's like, "No, we're actually running the trip." I'm like, "You're running the same route I'm running?" So they'd started in Alaska, and their goal was to jog or run to the tip of Argentina. I thought he was joking, so I looked him up. Oh, we're sitting there. I'm like, I gotta verify that's why we're sitting here because I think you're messing with me. And so him and a friend, there was two couples. The ladies they would drive, they'd be like the support vehicles. And the two guys started running together 6 days a week. So they would jog 6 days a week to get there. And then they rest on Sundays, and they hit Central America. It was a bit hot, so they would rotate one a day. But anyways, they had ran the whole trip at the same point I had run. And I was like, you are joking me. That was pretty impressive. And then I got down to Chile at one point, and I'd stop one time just to go in the kind of in the bush and look around, look for a camp spot. I turned around and I was coming back out of this sort of wildernessy area, and there's a guy standing just on the edge, like, stretching, and he's a Japanese guy, has like a sort of a Patagonia jacket on, track pants, running shoes. He's got a cart behind him that's maybe 4 or 5 feet long, made of aluminum, a couple wheels on the back. I looked at the guy because it was so out of place. We were like around nothing. We're just on the side of the road in southern Chile. And I looked at him, he looked at me, and I was like, "Hey." He was like, "Hey." And so we started chatting, and his English was better than my Japanese. So I asked him what he was up to, and he had walked the same route, which I'm sure you met other people who have. But he walked from Alaska to Argentina faster than I had driven the exact same route. And I was like, "How are you getting there faster than I am?" And then we talked about each other's trips, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, you walk every day." And I sort of meander around and linger a bit. But I had a couple of things, is that one, I was in no rush to go back. I really didn't have anything at the time that I was necessarily thinking about going back for. I basically lost everything I'd owned except for my house at that point, which I was rented out. And then I really didn't have anywhere I wanted to be other than on this road trip. And I also had a very limited budget. I was trying to stay within my $12 a day. So if you go slow enough on a small budget, then you can make the 12 bucks a day work. But if I was driving every day and constantly fueling up and all that kind of thing, then I would have burned through my cash pretty fast. So I'd say that that budget actually probably made my trip way better than it could have been. If I had a career to get back to and a six-figure salary I was worried about, and I had an ample supply of cash, I could have just burnt through from hotel to hotel day after day and got there. But because it was such a slow trip, I was able to meet a lot of locals and get to know the countryside. I got to camp in a lot of places. I probably camped 5 days a week for most of this trip. And I had a lot of time. So I'd say that the low budget was definitely the factor for sure. And once I was out there, I just wanted to see everything. So if you looked on the map, it looked maybe like a drunken spider had crawled across the Americas, because I go up and down and over and back up this way. And it was great. It was unbelievable.
I'm interested, the $12, was that 12 US or 12 Canadian?
Yeah, I should have made a point of that. So that would be around $9 US and $12 Canadian. Yeah, that was Canadian funds I was working with. When I was writing the book originally, I tried to break that down there.
And then how did you do it? Like, how did you make it work on $12 a day, which is, really limited, especially in some of those places. It can be expensive.
Yeah, so I got a tip. Someone else in another group I was part of had asked the same thing, like, how do people do this trip for so long? And he'd summarize it with go slow in the cheap places and go fast in the expensive places. And so I sort of worked with that mantra. The upside is that outside of Canada and the US, heading south, almost everywhere else is cheaper. Like almost every other country is basically dimes on the dollar kind of thing, where it costs very little. And so Mexico was super cheap. So I had my tent, I had my bike, I had my fishing rod, and I just sort of hung out. I wild camped. I literally camped probably 5 days a week for 2.5 years for the most part, unless I was staying with someone I met. And I'd just camp out and I could fish. And not that I was relying on fishing to feed me, because you could eat for pretty cheap, but I did catch quite a few fish actually on the trip and eat that once in a while. But it wasn't like I was hunting in the wilderness or anything crazy. But if you could live for $12 a day pretty easy in Mexico if you're camping out or staying with friends, or if you go to, say, let's say like Colombia. I think I was in Colombia for 3 months, and it's a very outdoorsy friendly place. So you could camp or wild camp or that kind of thing. A lot of places. You could camp all over the place, and the food's really cheap. And so you can make it happen really easy. And then I wasn't necessarily looking, I was looking for work online that I could try to invent an online job of somehow, but I sort of stumbled into an opportunity in El Salvador, where I was walking through this little town, and I was actually meant to find these hot springs, and I missed them because I got lost, which happened almost every day. And I ended up in this little town of Wayua, and I was trying to find somewhere to stay for the night. So I was looking around. I was a bit nervous because I'd only been in El Salvador for a couple of days, and you hear all these bad stories about the war and all this thing that have long since passed, but there's still a bit of concern. I was driving back and forth trying to find this hotel, and I was very lost in a very small town. And eventually a taxi guy saw me pass him probably 6 times. He stopped me. He's like, "What are you doing? Where are you trying to go?" I'm like, "I'm trying to find this hotel." And so he's like, "Well, that hotel isn't here, but we have this other hotel. I'll take it to you." And he just took me there, no charge. He just drove me. He's like, "This is where you want to go. Stop driving around. You look ridiculous. You're lost in a town with 4 streets." And so I ended up in there, and I got to chat with this one guy who was running this sort of hotel, hostel, and coffee shop sort of thing. And on day 2, he asked me what my plans were, and I said I didn't really have a lot of plans. And he's like, "Oh, if you want to learn about coffee, you can apprentice under me. We do a lot with coffee here. We have a coffee plantation, and you can work part-time at this hotel. And if that works for you, you basically get free room and board in exchange for your efforts." And I never thought about that before, and I gave it a go. And that was another game changer for sure. I spent a month with this guy. I didn't even drink coffee before that moment. I spent a month with this guy in El Salvador on these organic coffee farms on the volcanic mountain edges overlooking the valley. We did everything from helping the farmers pick the beans to roasting them, and we did coffee tours. And a month or 6 weeks, I think I was there with him in the end. And that helped obviously with my budget because it didn't cost me anything. And it also opened me up to a whole new world I didn't even know existed. And that guy definitely made my trip and life better. By the time I left there, I learned so much about El Salvador and the country and the coffee. And now I'm a bit of a coffee snob based on that experience, because now I'm like, "So you don't know where the beans came from? You don't know the farmer? You don't know the history?" Someone's like, "No, I just bought these at the store." I'm like, "Well, let me tell you a story about El Salvador." So things like that helped a lot with the budget and with the experience for sure.
You started the trip almost a decade ago. You've shared a few of the enduring memories, but are there other places that really just kind of knocked your socks off that, maybe people don't know about, but they should add to, kind of their bucket list of places to go and see?
If we're referencing that road trip still, yeah, for sure. There's a lot of really amazing places. I would say Bolivia is a spot on the planet that I feel is under traveled, which might be okay actually. It's kind of sometimes it's good if places are under traveled, but it's definitely on your exploration map. And I think a lot of people, I'm like, I was in Bolivia, and a lot of people I feel like might not even know where Bolivia is in the planet. And it is Bolivia is such a great place. It's still it still feels like it's another planet because it hasn't really evolved or like obviously in the big cities things are a little different, but once you get in the countryside, people are still living in little wooden shacks or mud huts kind of thing out in the countryside, and they have the Solar Uni there, this the world's largest salt flats. It's unbelievable just like staring out over this what was ocean at one time, which is now just like a dried salt flat at the moment, is amazing. And the mountains and the rivers and the culture and the food and the language and the people are so like warm and welcoming. The country's a little cold at places, but I would say Bolivia for sure. If you or anyone else who's listening to this hasn't been there, I would definitely put Bolivia on my list of places to visit for sure. It's unbelievable. And if you're concerned about your $12 a day budget, it's also an extremely cheap place to visit. It costs like the hotels, accommodation, touring around are very, very inexpensive. And then I think Colombia is a little more popular now. Colombia got a bad rap, obviously, for a couple decades there, and it still sort of grinds, I think, in the back of people's minds about being an unsafe place to travel. But the culture in Colombia and the people are like nowhere else on the planet. If people have been to Mexico, maybe they could probably say like Colombians are a bit like the Mexican cousins. They like to party and dance and have a good time, and everything's a little fiesta, and there's music in the streets and people dancing and climbing around. But the same thing, they have mountains and hiking and fishing and outdoors and a huge coffee culture. And the people are like unbelievably friendly, like a next level of friendly. To make friends in Colombia, you basically just have to smile, and they're like, "Oh, you're not from here? Oh, come with us. We'll take you to a party, and you can hang out with us," which happened many times, many times. I would say Colombia is definitely one for sure. And then if I could pick one more out of maybe South America, I would probably say like a lot of people have been to Brazil, but the one thing that I like the most, I never thought I would get the chance to do. I don't even know why. Even though I was on that trip, I didn't know why. I still didn't think it would happen. But going to the Amazon is I think it's a life changing moment, especially if you get the chance to drive through it. To fly into Manaus or something and truck on a tour boat out to the bushes would be obviously very cool. But if given the chance to drive through there and just sort of see the changes live and the animals and the people, it's really it's the most for me. It was like the most. It was like the biggest highlight and a very depressing at the same time because you would literally see big logging trucks leveling Amazonian trees that are presumably hundreds or thousands of years old and cutting them into big chunks and laying them on trucks and hauling them out of the rainforest. And I was just like, I could just feel my heart stop as I was watching them haul these loads out of there. But then you meet the people and the cultures and the animals. And once you get to see them and get to experience a bit of the Amazonian culture, it's just like it's a total life changer for sure. It's just an amazing part of the planet that is so unique and obviously is changing every day, which I don't think is for the best, but that's the way the world goes. So if you get the chance to see it, I would definitely see it now as far as maybe top three in South America.
Most people wonder about safety on a motorbike, and we talked a little bit about the Ewan McGregor movies, where the only place he had an accident was actually in Calgary. He was stopped at a light, and another car, excuse me, another car drove up and hit him. I remember with my wife watching. I'm like, how did he get hit in Calgary? But what was safety like for you? Like, did you have the same experience in terms of it's actually pretty safe to drive a motorbike all over these, rugged, remote places?
Yeah, I think that mindset's a popular word right now, but I think that the mindset when you're in different countries that people have to think about is if you go to Nicaragua or something like that, and you're driving around, presumably the guy you're passing probably doesn't have any kind of insurance. And if you had insurance, which was obligatory in a lot of places, it probably wasn't going to be valid or acted upon anyway. And so I think of the people driving around, one, they know that there's no safety blanket for them. Two, the vehicle or motorbike or whatever they're on, it's probably in questionable condition at best. I'm sure the brakes are falling off, or maybe the gears don't work, or it's an old tired bike, or what have you. And so I think they know that too, and so they drive a little extra cautiously, kind of knowing that there's no safety net, there's no medical insurance, there's no vehicle insurance, that kind of thing. And so they're a lot more cautious to make sure they're not at fault. Or I find that driving in North America, for example, it's almost like if something happens, it's someone else's fault. And so their insurance will cover it. They were at fault. They were on their phone. They were doing something. It's always someone's fault that something happened. And so when I saw that clip, which I've watched that series many times now, but I think when I saw that clip, it was almost uncanny, because I'm like, of course, you would drive around the whole world and be worried about everything, and people constantly give warnings about how to be cautious and what to do and how unsafe it is everywhere and how you always got to watch your back. And then in presumably one of the safest places on the planet due to road signs, speed limits, police, safety of vehicles is the one place where he gets in an accident. I was like, of course it was. I'm so glad that was caught on film, actually, because it had to happen there. So I think in terms of like driving around safety, sure, it was unsafe. Like people, lots of places it's good because they know they've grown up on motorbikes. And so someone has grown up on they've lived their whole life with their kids on the back of a scooter or a small 150cc or a pedal bike, that kind of thing. And so people on those same roads are aware where the bikes are. They can actually see them and they're aware of where they are. And the person driving them is also fairly cautious and concerned about what's going on around them. Where I find, like, especially in Canada of all places, because the outdoor season here is so short, it could be like 3, 4, 5, 6 months maybe. But I've almost been hit a number of times. I usually don't get mad about it because I actually don't even think the person sees me. I'll be driving along, I'll be on a bike, and someone will just look both ways at the stop sign and they'll go and they'll bolt through, and I'm like just sort of miss me. That could have been it. I could have been road pizza right there. But I also know that person literally is probably used to looking for a big pickup truck or a bus or a car or something, and likely didn't even see me. So it can definitely be questionable in a lot of places. More so, I think, because of the roads and the people, though. Like if you drive through somewhere, I don't know if you've been to Guatemala or not, but if you drive through the roads in Guatemala, which were some of the worst I'd seen in the Americas, you'd be driving along and then all of a sudden you just be like part of the road missing. Like just a huge, like a car swallowing size of the road is actually just gone. So if you weren't paying attention, you would be in that hole, and you're not suing the government there. You're not going to be like, oh, sorry, but the road was bad. They'd be like, what? Get out of the country. Like, what are you doing? We're going to drive. So I think that it's almost safer in places that people are worried about your vehicle safety in terms of driving. You got to be cautious of lots of things, but I would say that would be one of the upsides, is that people are used to such bad driving.
One of our podcast guests, a guy actually works at 10 Adventures, is doing a similar trip in his car. Excuse me. And I'm interested, how do you think your trip in a motorbike would be different from, a person who's driving it in a car or a pickup or something like that?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're maybe on a pedal bike or on foot or on a motorbike, it's a different experience altogether than being in a vehicle. So we did a honeymoon in Africa for about 6 months and rented a truck with a tent on the roof and drove around, which was amazing, by the way. But it was definitely a different experience than if you're just available for the people. So I find that inside a vehicle, you're in like a little bubble. And so it's nice, it's fine. You got air conditioning and snacks and it's music and everything is great. But you're not like right in the spaces and faces of the people who live in the countries, where if you're hiking it or pedal biking it or motorbiking it or something like that, there's like no barricade between you and anyone. So if someone wants to like impulse talk to you or pull up beside you and have a quick chat, if you pull up beside me in South Africa and knock on my window to have a talk, I'm probably going to be a little apprehensive and not going to want to roll down the window. But if that exact same scenario took place where I was in Chile and a guy pulled up behind me in a motorcycle and tapped me on the shoulder and was like, hey man, that's a cool bike, or hola señor, me gusta tu bicicleta, or whatever he's going to say to me, then it's a totally different experience. You like bond like that because he probably has a pedal bike or he probably has a motorbike, and you become friends. And he's like, oh, come, I'll show you around and we'll take you on a tour, which has also happened when people have been like, oh, just just come, I'll show you around. Like, you like motorbikes or whatever you're into, I'm happy to take you on a tour. So you're in it. You're right in with the people. There's no way out. You're in their same space. They're in your same space. And you have something to bond about instantly, whether you know the language or don't know the language. So I think if given the chance to do it on a motorbike or a pedal bike, I would I would vote motorbike or pedal bike all the time. It's gonna be harder. You gotta put with the elements and the rain and the sun and the dirt, but the experience is gonna be that much richer. Like most things in life, the harder it is, usually the better the payoff. So that would definitely be my vote for sure if given the chance.
One thing people love about, great cycling routes or great walks is the community. And you mentioned there's a community on the motorbike trails as well. But I know when I look at kind of groups out riding here in, Western Canada, some of them seem to be a bunch of just regular dudes. And then some of them seem to be like, Hell's Angels or guys where they're all wearing leather stuff. And it seems like there's kind of two groups of folks that ride on this trip. Like, is it the same thing that there's like kind of like two cultures of riders and you mix with one, or like how does that work? Because I wouldn't want to mix necessarily with a bunch of dudes who seem aggressive or like are wearing some sort of gang colors.
Yeah, for sure. I think that like a lot of groups in the world, there's definitely like a culture and then a subculture. I feel like when you're inside of like a motorbike culture, for sure, there's definitely a subculture. So I would say if I had to associate with one of those groups, I'm definitely in the adventure motorbike category, which sold me on the title right away. My friend was like, "You should get an adventure bike." And I'm like, "What's an adventure bike?" So he explained it's a bike that you can basically take off road or through the mountains and that kind of thing. I'm like, "Yep, that's a bike for me." It has the word adventure in the title. I'm taking it. But even driving around North America, oh man, there's just like a distinct group for sure. Usually, what I didn't know when I started motorbiking, was that bikers usually wave at each other, which I was unaware of. So if you pass a motorcycler on the road, they'll wave at you just because you're kind of in the same club per se. And the first day I was biking with my friend on his bike there, this guy waved at me. I thought I knew him. And so I looked and I was like, oh, hey. I'm like, oh, hey. Well, that's weird. How would anyone know me? And then 2 seconds later, we passed someone else and they waved. And I was like, who? Like, do I know these guys? So probably 5 people had waved at me that afternoon. And we stopped and I asked my friend, I'm like, you're supposed to wave at everyone who's on a bike? He's like, oh, yeah, right. You'll probably figure that out. Bikers usually wave at each other. I'm like, oh, I had no idea. So you're like instantly friends even from across the road. But then I realized that inside of those waving cultures, that generally, if I saw a guy on a typical, what you would maybe call a biker, with a leather vest and a big loud Harley and ripping down the road and trying to make like get himself noticed, that those people tend to associate with each other, I find. And then those of us in the other subcategory, maybe who are on the off-road style motorcycles, the adventure bikes, would more wave at each other. So even if I was to wave at the guy in the leathers with the loud bike, they usually, not always, not everyone's the same, but typically they wouldn't wave back at you because they're like, you're just like, you're not part of my club. And so I found traveling around too that, yeah, if you spotted someone in a similar style of bike with you, then it was almost like a magnet. They would come up. It was almost, you had something to share and something to talk about. But if I was trying to maybe small talk with the guy who drove paved roads from city to city versus trying to small talk with the guy who'd driven back roads from mountain to mountain, I would have a much better connection with the guy I could connect with who'd driven the same sort of roads and routes I'd been on. So there's definitely a subculture within the culture. And once you're in it, it's easier to spot for sure. But those people definitely attract each other. And it was interesting in like countries with smaller bikes, because if you're on like a mid-size motorcycle in like the Americas, like a 650cc or something like that, it's like a medium range or small sort of bike here. But once you hit Mexico and south, excluding maybe Chile and Colombia, that is considered a really big bike. So something would be more like a 150 or 250, a smaller CC bike, which is kind of the one I drove across Canada last year. And those people I always kind of felt like they were like almost like looked up, like, wow, that's amazing. You have such a huge adventure bike. But I was looking at them and I'd be like, wow, it's so cool. You have this like little nimble bike you can take wherever you want. So there's a little bit of envy from both sides of the coin too.
Looking back on that journey, how do you think the trip changed you?
Yeah, it's tough to do a trip like that and not feel changed. I think I think any major thing in someone's life would change them presumably for the better. Whether you're raising kids, as I'm sure you're very aware that that experience is going to completely change your outlook on life, or maybe you've IPO'd a big company on the stock exchange and it's been a lot of work to get there. It's going to change your life. Or if you spent 2.5 years alone inside of a motorcycle helmet driving some challenging parts of the world, then that experience would change you and definitely changed me for sure. I was sort of lucky and unlucky that I did that particular trip alone because I had so much time alone. And I see people who've done like the 10-day retreats alone or like a week long in the bush alone, and that sort of that they've come on a different person or what have you. I'm not saying mine's any better or any worse, but I did essentially the better part of 2.5 years by myself, just like with nothing but free time to think all day long. If you try and meditate for half an hour, it's hard. If you try and meditate for a year alone inside your helmet, that is a challenging experience. And all the things you think you've ever maybe forgotten or pushed down, like or shoved or whatever, pushed away in your life come up to the surface, whether it's some sort of bad relationship or sketchy childhood moment or some candy you stole as a kid or some really stupid mistake that I made or what have you. All of those moments come up, every one of them. You have to or get to relive them all. And so that time alone definitely, I think it made me a better person because all the stuff I'd sort of thought like, yeah, it's under the carpet now. I actually had to go and deal with all of it, which was hard. It was super hard. But after it's over with, you sort of dealt with it and you don't feel so bad about things anymore. And I would say going that kind of trip or any sort of trip around the world alone is definitely a bonus too, because you also are forced to meet people. So unless you want to be alone all the time, which is going to wear off fast, then you have no choice but to meet the local somehow. And so I was lucky where a lot of people didn't. I think if there was me and another male, I don't think I wouldn't have met almost as many people, even probably a little bit of the same amount of people. But since I was alone, people almost kind of felt a little bit concerned for me. Like, you're alone, you should probably some family or a nice place to stay. Is everything okay? We'll look after you. And so I ended up staying with a lot of families. And then you get to know the family because you don't have a choice but to like learn the language, eat the food, sit at the table, cook whatever they're cooking. And that experience, if you're living with a person in a foreign country for 2 weeks or a month or what have you at a time, you know their culture and what they think of your culture or what the real insights of their culture are is a total game changer. I think I spent a month or 5 weeks with this family in Peru that I just fell into their yard basically and ended up spending a night, then 2, then a week, and 4. And that was the most Spanish I had to talk on the whole trip, and I didn't have a choice. No one spoke English anywhere around, and so I'd practice a lot, but at that point I'm like, it's all or nothing. You can't just sit here and not talk. And then we had brunches together, lunches, and I worked with the family on their little coffee plantation, and we're still friends to this day. I talk to them on a fairly regular basis. And before that, when they met me, the guy had seen tourists before. It wasn't a touristy spot, but they'd obviously seen travelers and tourists. And he saw my bike, and you never see a traveler working. You only see them having fun. And so the guy always thought, like, all these people come from North America. They're all millionaires who don't have to work. All these people who travel around. And so that's what he thought of me. He just thought I was a millionaire to travel around. And so he asked me one day, like, what I was doing. I went to town. I'm like, I have this job where I write online. I was making like $7 an article to write clickbait articles. And he's like, you're going to town to work every day? I'm like, you have to write these little articles while I travel. He said, why do you work? I'm like, well, I have to pay for everything. So I explained my $12 budget, and he started laughing. He's like, I explained it in soles, the Peruvian currency. He's like, you're traveling on that budget on this trip and getting through everywhere? I'm like, yeah, that's what I have to work with. And he's like, oh, I thought everyone was like millionaires and super rich. I'm like, oh, no. All these people are kind of the same as me. They just sort of figured out a way to do it for a small chunk of time, be it 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years. But I think that was really helpful to him because he sort of felt a little bit better about all the people he met that were like good people. They're not just a bunch of loaded people who are never working and came to exploit the country. They're all just the same as him. We just happen to live somewhere with a stronger currency. We want to know his country. So it was good for both of us. I think we both learned something about each other, and that experience repeated itself enough times on the trip where I think a lot of people learned a bit more about the Western traveler, and I learned certainly a lot about cultures that I feel other people are like, oh my God, that's so scary. They're going to kill you. And I'm like, well, like the grandma who made me breakfast and the family who like gave me the kids' bed for a week. These are the people you're worried about meeting. So I think it was good for both sides for sure.
In 2023, you rode through every province and territory in Canada um, to try and tell the story about food. And I know in your other videos, in your blog posts, with other trips, you talk about food. Why is food so important to making a journey great, do you think?
Food is like the mold that brings the world together, I think, anywhere on the planet. So we were on a trip. Me and my wife went to Africa for 6 months for honeymoon. That was in 2022, which was amazing, by the way. That was just when the world was like coming off of the pandemic. There was nobody there. It was amazing. We basically traveled around without bumping into people for weeks at a time. It was probably one of the greatest times to travel. So on that trip, I read a book by this guy, his name's Justin Bonello or something, called Cooked in Africa. And so he went around the southern part of Africa, sort of exploring the foods, getting to know the cultures, and learning a bit about his own backyard. And I was like, you know what? I actually don't know anything about Canada. Like I know a little bit, but if someone was to say like, where's the best place to go and the most unique foods and best cultures, I'd pick a few highlights, like maybe people from Newfoundland are friendly, or go to PEI. It's the salt of the earth sort of thing. Or if you want adventure and cowboys, go to Alberta, whatever. And it never occurred to me that I actually don't know almost anything about my own backyard, despite traveling through quite a bit of the rest of the planet or living in different countries. So I told my wife that I was going to do this trip. I was going to go across Canada and just meet people and document the food and culture in each country. And she's like, we're still on our honeymoon. I'm like, okay, I'll wait. I'll plan this when we get back. But I'm like, just so you know, this is what I want to do. And she's like, okay, whatever. So I left the plan. I just snow melt to snowfall, basically, to pull it off. I wanted to do every drivable province and territory I could get through in that amount of time, and just meet the local people I didn't know much about and discover their foods and cultures. And so it was hard. That was definitely challenging for sure, to get people on short notice to open up their kitchen and door to you and give you a snapshot into their world and then let you film it and document it and write about it. But I met so many great people in this country. So like and the food changes so much from place to place. I had no idea. So I went to this one place in the Nass Valley. I'll try and just summarize the critical highlights rather than going through the whole country. But I went to this one place in the Nass Valley in sort of northern British Columbia. One way in, one way out. The road ends in a place called Kincolith or Gringalock, something like that. It has two names. They also have like the indigenous name and then the other previously known name. And the road ends there. It goes right out to the ocean, right to the Pacific Ocean. And there was no road till I think 2013 was the first time they actually put a road in. So it was only boat or plane in before that. And on my way in there, I met a local guy from the Niska First Nations people. And he was like, well, have you ever tried sea lion? I'm like, what do you mean I tried sea lion? He's like, you haven't ever eaten sea lion before? I'm like, you can eat sea lion? He's like, oh yeah, of course we eat it all the time. And so that was my first like, boom, aha moment. That there's a place in the country where they eat sea lion on a regular basis. That's no big deal to them, where I didn't even know it was a thing. And I've lived here my whole life. So he invited me over inside of his house, brought me inside. They were having smoked sea lion ribs for dinner that night. Showed me how to cook them, explained how they hunt them and harvest them. And then I sat down with this family for dinner at their kitchen table. I just met him that day. And we had smoked sea lion dinner. And then the following day, he took me down to the community smokehouses where I think there's 4 sort of shed size, maybe 10 by 10 wooden smokehouses in the middle of the town. The community does, and they mostly do the meats for the elders who can't hunt for themselves anymore. They have strips of sea lion like hanging inside of these smokers with like alder wood smoking below and curing the meat, and it's dripping, and it smells amazing. The meat smells kind of sweet. And then you go inside, they have a little house in there where the people are apprenticing and learning, like people from the community. And one guy's got jars of stuff on the table. And I'm like, what's in the jar? He's like, oh, it's just pickled flipper. And I'm like, what pickled flipper? What? He's like, pickled sea lion flipper. I'm like, this is pickled sea lion flipper? And he's like, you never had pickled sea lion flipper? I'm like, I've never had pickled sea lion flipper. He's like, oh, it's great. So they jar it and they pickle up the flipper and it goes in the jar. And it's like a snack. It's like pickles, cheese, and crackers sort of thing. That's what they had. So to try all these unique foods. And that was probably experience number 3. And I was just getting started. And from there, it just got more and more interesting. I did a thing in the Northwest Territories. I met this guy, got in touch with him. He's a teepee, sort of deep in the woods. I had to go and find him, and he took me in there. He actually come and rescue me. I got lost in the woods, actually. I couldn't get to his camp, and he had to come and rescue me on this 8x8 Argo. and took me back to his camp. He had a teepee in the woods, and he had shot ptarmigan and muskrat, and he had caribou ribs. And so he was just like, he had a birch wood fire going in there. He barbecued ribs for me, and he showed me how to clean a muskrat, and we cooked it up, and we ate the tail and the ribs and stuff. And I was just like, overload. I'd never seen this stuff before. And the setting was unbelievable. Northwest Territories in early spring, where the guy's cooking muskrat in front of you. It was unbelievable. It was amazing. So I've been documenting that via film and for another book I'm writing right now. And then I made myself all over the East Coast. So I wound through, the culture in Quebec is obviously very unique to Canada, and the foods there are unbelievable. There's some subcultures in there of different sort of foods they have, like the tortilla sort of thing. And then wound my way as far as we could east. And a unique experience, I would say, if I had to pick one of the East Coast, would be just a lobster boil on the red sand beaches of PEI. I met some people. Took my bike out on the beach. They built a driftwood fire. Someone had caught some lobster. They had a pot boiling, and you're just out there on the edge of the ocean with the waves coming over with like a group of friends having beers and boiling lobster. Oh my God. Like, if that experience was worth $1,000, I probably would have paid for it, but it was nothing. It was just like some salt of the earth people in PEI who were like, you ever had lobster boil on the beach before, on these like red sandy beaches where the waves lapping in the background? I'm like, no, I have not. So that was unbelievable. So I filmed that whole trip and been writing for it. So I'm about probably halfway through a book on Canadian cuisine and culture, and then I'm about a third of the way through the videos to turn into like a travel series when it's all said and done. But that it was amazing. Just to learn about your own country was unbelievable. I'd recommend it to anyone, because it's such a unique opportunity to get to know your own backyard, but you think you might know, but you probably haven't seen it all.
Kix, it was great to hear about these stories and your passion for the food. And yeah, I didn't know anything about eating sea lions. I don't know if I would, but thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing all these incredible journeys with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for kind of deviating a bit from your norm a little bit. I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts, and I'm always like, what? How did you get from here? How did you hike to there? What did you do? So it's really neat and really inspirational to hear people get around the world, no matter how they do it. So yeah, much appreciated for letting me talk about my little version of how I did it.
If people want to check out, you wrote a book about your motorbike journey to Argentina. You have a bunch of videos. Where can people find the content that you're creating about these great journeys?
Yeah, for sure. So you can just search, probably the easiest way is to search my name. It's all under my name, Kix Marshall, Kix Marshall. I have a website, and on there it links all the blog stories. And then if someone wants to buy the book I wrote about the Argentina trip, then you can buy through there. It's on Amazon. You can just search my name on Amazon too, and it comes up right away. And then same thing on YouTube, just the video series we've started to document is on there. I'm giving YouTube a crack. It's new to me, so I'm trying it out. But it's fun to show people their own lives, actually, when it's all said and done. So if you want to check out the stories there and sort of get to know Canada or Canada's backyard, yeah, just check out Kix Marshall or kixmarshall.com. That'd be great.
Wicked. I'll put links in the show notes. And with that, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week with more epic adventures. Bye-bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.